Hi everyone, Magnus here, and today I'm covering a game that was just played in round number 7 of the 2024 FIDE Olympiad, and that game is between Gukesh, the World Championship challenger in the next couple of months, against Grandmaster Wei Yi from China in the India versus China match. I just covered a game on Wei Yi and showed his excellent endgame conversion skills. And now in this game, I'm going to be doing the same, except with Gukesh, and we're really seeing that Gukesh is just in absolutely amazing form in this event. I think he's something like plus 16 or 17 rating points, which is simply incredible at the 2760 level. So in the live ratings, he's sitting pretty nice at 2780. I do think that might put him in like the top 5. Yeah, so very, very good stuff from Gukesh. Let's get straight into the game. So getting into the game, we have e4 from Gukesh, best by test, and pawn to c5 from Wei Yi. This is the most combative response that black can choose, controlling the center with a flank pawn, knight to f3, d6, inviting the open Sicilian. But Gukesh says no, he plays knight to c3, keeping the open Sicilian possibility flexible, but also maybe intending moves like slow moves like bishop to e2, castles, or bishop to b4 potentially. Knight to f6 from Wei Yi, Gukesh plays bishop e2, and we see e5. And Gukesh, after the move e5, notices that this pawn has now moved 2 squares. It cannot go backwards, and for this reason, he seizes control of this nice diagonal here, because the pawn can no longer go to e6. It is now on e5, and he will forever pressure this f pawn, as well as have excellent control of the d5 hole. Bishop e7, d3 from Gukesh. Knight c6, bishop g5, and bishop g5 is a very nice move because it attacks the horsey, which is controlling this d5 square. So Gukesh is potentially going to capture this knight, plant something on the d5 square, and his point is that he still has a pawn that can go to c3, so black cannot get access to this central outpost. Meanwhile, Gukesh's pieces cannot be kicked from this forever hole. So we see castles, bishop takes f6, bishop f6, knight d5. As explained, this knight cannot go to this outpost because the pawn will simply kick it away. And after bishop to e6, which makes sense, you want to try and relinquish some pressure potentially. Moves like g6, bishop g7, f5 also. And you want to try and start expanding on the queen side. So, black's very flexible here. Black has got a clamp, but at the same time, white has a nice piece in the center. So it's definitely an interesting trade-off. We see queen d2, a6 preparing b5. a4 seems like the natural move here, stopping b5. But Gukesh decides to castle, allow b5, play bishop to b3, because you cannot go c4 as the d pawn is already covering that. Now, this does seem like extremely provocative play from Gukesh, definitely playing for a win here. Generally, you don't want to allow black to be pushing you around this much, as this kind of seems like the dream setup for black, with all these pawns expanded, so much space, and the possibility for this f5 pawn break. I mean, it looks like white really doesn't have a whole lot of play, but Gukesh is just letting Wei Yi come towards him, and he's waiting for the right moment to counter-strike and start fighting back. We see king h8, Wei Yi wants to go g6, bishop g7, f5, a3 from Gukesh, kind of taking things slow, not playing the a4 move here. He's just playing a3. He wants to allow Wei Yi to push him forward and put the bishop safely on a2. We see rook to b8, looking to expand, h3, and of course g6, Wei Yi going for the classic bishop g7, f5 plan. c3 from Gukesh, stopping any knights or pieces from jumping in here and trying to possibly weaken the move b4, and bishop g7, bishop a2 now. Once again, getting out of any b-file nonsense. This bishop is much safer on the a2 square, and f5. Wei Yi lashes out. Knight goes to g5. Attacks the bishop. The bishop can, however, just retreat to the g8 square. And once this does happen, it just looks like black is clearly better. Black has the bishop pair. Black has a pawn, pawns rolling down the king side, and this is kind of like a king's Indian for black, except white doesn't really have any play that white would normally have on the queen side. So to me, it just looks like white's suffering a little bit here. So Gukesh decides to try and take matters into his own hands. He captures, and plays f4. Because if he didn't play f4 and played a move like rook d8, for example, there is pawn to f4 from black, and this position looks horrible. There's pretty much no play here for the white pieces. Queen e8, queen g6 is coming, h6. There's just so much pressure that's going to be down on this king. This looks horrible, and once again, none of the usual queenside play for white. So he plays f4, trying to shut down the kingside attack, and c4, a very thematic move from Wei Yi. We see a capture, and another capture. Wei Yi has sacrificed a pawn on c4, but with the move knight to a5, bishop a2, knight b3, takes and takes, this actually looks quite good for black, considering that you can stack up lots and lots of pressure on this pawn. And if you try to ever bring your knight back into the game, for example, so let's say you play rook f2 to guard the pawn. If you play rook f2, there's rook to b5 attacking the knight, and the knight doesn't have many squares. If the knight goes to e3, there's e takes on f4, hitting the knight, and after something like rook takes on f4, there's queen takes on g5, and the other knight drops off the board. So this doesn't look very good for white, but for some reason Wei Yi kind of messed up the move order here, and he actually took on f4 first. Now the difference between this is that although it looks appealing because you're attacking this knight on g5 immediately, after knight to f3 and now knight to a5, the point is that bishop a2, knight b3 takes and takes is very different. And the reason for that is actually because of rook to f2. The point being that you're now guarding your knight. So you're guarding the pawn here so that the queen can now take the knight back. And if you try and go rook to b5, there's just knight takes on f4, which wasn't a possibility previously when there was a white pawn on f4. The knight would have had to go to e3 and you would have captured it. So there are some pretty subtle nuances in the move order here. Gukesh instead plays knight takes on f4, also an extremely reasonable move. You get the knight out of trouble and also don't lose this b pawn here. But now after queen to b6, now rook f2, you are guarding the pawn, but you've got these very ugly backwards pawns, which Wei Yi gangs up on with the move rook to b8. And now if you aren't quick with these moves, the move knight to d4 will come, and white will win the games, but Wei Yi is in time with rook to b8. Rook goes to d1, now counter-attacking this d pawn, so if you trade everything, white will win the d pawn. And so after the exchanges, white wins the d-pawn, has these very nice ponies against these bishops. Now I'm going to speed a little bit through these moves. Gukesh goes for the bishop here, and we see a check, pins, and now sacrifice. And here we enter the critical position of the game. It's two knights versus a rook. Can the World Championship challenger Gukesh show his endgame finesse, play a little bit like Magnus, and try and grind this one out? Now, only white's really playing for the win here. This pawn is relatively easy for the knights to guard on the a-file, and in the meantime, he's going to use his other knight to try and harass these pawns, potentially harass the king, and try and also attack the rook. So let's see, can Gukesh get this done? We see rook to c1, knight defends the pawn, also moves to the center. The king is now moving about, and the other knight also jumps into the center of the board, attacking the rook on c2, and creating this kind of Ouroboros with the two horses guarding each other. Horse guards the pawn, horse attacks the rook, horse attacks the pawn. This looks like a very nice knight configuration for Gukesh. So the rook gives a check, the king moves up, and now he starts rearranging his ponies. He puts them back. Always repeat one time, gets a little bit more time on the clock. Good technique from Gukesh here. The rook goes and attacks the pawn. King runs back to f2. Knight goes to e2. And Gukesh is looking to reconfigure his pieces potentially like this, because he wants his pawn to be a little bit more advanced on a4, so that it's close to becoming a queen. Potentially, if you were to win this pawn, there's definitely some deep endgame ideas here from Gukesh. So the rook attacks the knight, knight jumps back, and pawn to a4. So this pawn is a little bit easier to defend on a4, and the knights can get deeper into the position while still maintaining the defense. So the king moves in, we see g3, king goes to e3, The king kind of starts shuffling about. Gukesh now with a very nice maneuver here. He retreats the knight to g1, and now the knight can come back into the center of the board to a more active role. Knight to c6 is threatened with a fork on the rook and the pawn. Rook goes to pin the knight. King moves to the side. A little bit of shuffling. And now the rook is attempting to go to b5 here. Gukesh defends it tactically with the move knight to f4. You cannot go rook to b5 because that would blunder a rook. Rook moves in, king moves up. Gukesh shuffling about, gives a check here so that you can't take the h-pawn. King moves back and pawn to h4 played, getting the pawn out of harm's way. We see rook h3, knight to e2 defending the pawn, and it looks like there's this nice move f4, which Wei Yi does play. And the idea is that if you take this way, there's rook takes on f3, and if you take this way, then there's rook takes on g3, and you will probably lose the game. However, none of that actually happens. Gukesh finds the only move, knight f to g1 here. If you were to move the other knight to the g file, of course, that would also drop the pawn. So Gukesh, very nice spot. With only 2 minutes remaining, by the way, the players are getting quite low on time here. He moves his knight back, and after Wei Yi moves his rook up, back, he captures on f4, rook takes on h4, and knight to f3. Now, at this point, Wei Yi would like a draw, and Gukesh is trying to grind it out. But Wei Yi only needs, Wei Yi doesn't actually need to keep the rook here for a knight. He can actually just sacrifice the rook for one of the pawns and then try and win the other pawn. Now, of course, he can't do this just yet because, you know, the king is not in time. The king can simply block it off on c3, reminding me of the Arjun game, the very nice game. There was a positional one run by Arjun a couple days ago, where the king just blocks the other one off just in time to prevent the king from running over and winning this flank pawn. So this doesn't happen. The rook moves back, trying to go around, collect the a-pawn, and then sacrifice itself for the f-pawn. But after the f-pawn starts moving forward, Wei Yi goes a little bit wrong with this move, pawn to h5. Now, the engine does like rook to a1, but I will agree that after the move knight to c3, defending the pawn, it starts to look incredibly tricky with this f-pawn moving forward, and you don't have as much play with your fast h-pawn. So the move h5 is very understandable. He wants to start pushing the pawn down the board, and knight to c3 is played from Gukesh, trying to centralize his horses and push his own f-pawn down the board, so it is a race. The pawn goes to h4, we see a check, king goes back, another check, king goes back, pawn goes to f6, and pawn to h3. Now, supposedly, this is the final nail in the coffin for Wei Yi. The game is now objectively lost. It could have apparently been held after rook to d1, king goes to e3, rook e1, king f3, and pawn to h3. Now, this is very weird stuff. The knight can go back to defend this pushing square, but now after rook goes to g1, you threaten to sacrifice the rook for the knight and push through the h-pawn. This is pretty suspicious. I guess you can't push this forward as well because the king gets back, although all of this is really difficult to see and understand, especially when you have 1 minute and 25 seconds on your clock. So h3, and there's no more time control to get to, so these players are just playing blitz at this point. And we know that Gukesh has actually struggled with little time on his clock in like the candidates. For example, against there's that famous game where he was playing Alireza Firouzja and messed up that, I think it was better, and then it went to equal, and then it was losing. So he has been known to struggle a little bit in time trouble, but I imagine he's been working on that for his World Championship preparation. Pawn goes to f7, threatening to promote. The rook has to defend. If the king goes up here, this would be not very good because of the move knight to g5. Now there's knight g6 and promotion as a threat. So the rook goes here and knight to g5 anyway, attacking the pawn and threatening to block this f-file with a pony and then look to promote the pawn. So after the pawn pushes, this very nice move, knight to f3. I think the other knight wins as well, but this knight goes to f3. Now the threat is promotion. If you promote, then there's actually a forced mate in 10 with queen to e7, king here. I don't really see it, to be honest with you guys. Knight to c4 here. Queen e6, king b7. Okay. I mean, this is weird. It's an engine line, and supposedly this is checkmate. I don't think either player saw that, but intuitively, there is a king hunt that will happen. after this, and with the 2 ponies very close to the king and able to jump in, obviously Wei Yi probably didn't like his chances with just promoting, so he delivers he doesn't deliver a check. He moves his king up. If he were to deliver a check, this might keep black in the game a little bit longer, although I don't really see the follow-up to the white king just moving in. The engine's giving some really weird lines that I don't actually think hold. King goes to e7, and knight takes on h2 here, and you are not in time to win either of these pawns because the 2 ponies are going to jump back in, guard the pawn, and then try and promote. So after the rook attacks the pawn, knight jumps in, king goes back. If the king went up, of course you hang a pawn with check. You don't want to do that. So the king has to go back, and the king goes back to the right square. If the king went back here, then there would be rook a4 again, and there would be rook f4 coming. But the difference is that after king to d2, if there's rook takes on f4, there's knight to h6. And this is what was played in the game. And now if the king would have gone to e2 after rook here and knight to h6, there is rook to e4, and that wins the knight. So you couldn't go there. So good, accurate spot from Gukesh. Goes king d2, the only move. And I don't know, after king c2, rook takes on a4, knight to h6, rook to a2, king d3, there's rook f2. So the difference is the king has to be close enough to this side of the board that it can go and stop the rook from attacking the pawn, but also far enough away that you can't skewer the knight. So very interesting stuff here. Gukesh picks the middle of the road, and he picks the porridge that's just right, and Wei Yi captures the pawn on a4, knight to h6. Now Gukesh is cradling. He's cradling his last pawn left. If this pawn dies, then he can't win the game. Now, yeah, unfortunately for Wei Yi, rook a2 and rook f2 doesn't work because the king can go to e3, which it does. Some more checks are given, but there is now simply nothing more to be done. Another check will be met with king to f5, and the king and the horses will escort the promotion through. If you were to play this move here, rook to the back, to try and get one last trick of a check, if the king moves away, because this would be a draw. So let's say you would do this here, promote, check, and if the king moves out of the way, of course, this game is a draw. You can't checkmate with the 2 ponies and the outside pawn. This is not one of the checkmates that is possible. Even with this pawn blockaded, I'm not sure if it's a win for white. However, of course, after the check, there is the simple and elegant knight to f4, blocking the pawn from blocking the rook from accessing the queen, and there is no skewer. So, an absolutely clinical endgame, played in extreme time pressure from Gukesh. Very, very nice win for him, securing India the win just about 2.5, 1.5 against the Chinese team. So that is excellent to see, and we're going to have an interesting World Championship match coming in the next few months. I know that Ding has said that he thinks that Gukesh is the favorite, which is a little bit concerning to see. You don't really like to see the world champion saying that the challenger is the favorite, although I think it might be the case in the current form. We'll have to see. I really hope that Ding can sort of get his mojo back and get some confidence. So I'd like to see him doing well in the latter half of this Olympiad event. I will be sure to post a video when Ding gets his first win, because I don't think it's happened yet, unfortunately. I'll have to check that out. Let's try and find Ding. Let me just find him for a second. Ding. So yeah, Ding hasn't scored a victory yet. He's down 9 points in this event, 4 draws and a loss. So he was very solid, but unfortunately recently had a loss. So yeah, I will be making a video on Ding when or if he gets his first win. So if you guys did enjoy this video, please do consider liking and subscribing, as I will be uploading more on the Olympiad to come. And otherwise, yeah, I'll just see you guys in the next video. Bye.